in particular will suffer the greatest penalties for this because, the oldest people on earth today have accumulated far more debt during their lifetimes that hasn't been paid down, resolved, which is accumulated further, the interest of which has caused debt to increase all the further on the behalf of government, for instance, and to just pass it on to the next generation or the generation after that or the however many generations after that, of course, is criminal. We need to understand that all these problems are caused by this purposed obfuscation of the currency. This is actually a criminal act against us. It's always been a criminal act every time it's happened in history. So our three categoric faults, the first was proprietary, that is, is proportional improprieties. That is, inflation and deflation are increases or decreases in circulation per represented property. So to resolve those is a very simple matter, and I'll get to that in a moment. But after some time, I realized that there was yet a third part of those volumetric improprieties, and that is this maldisposition that I've described. Maldisposition being defined, it's a term intrinsic to the development of mathematically perfected economy. And maldisposition means this refers to this ever greater dedication of ever more of a circulation to servicing debt versus sustaining the industry and commerce which are obligated to do so. So out of whatever the circulation, more and more and more of it is dedicated to servicing debt, leaving less and less to sustain industry and imposing all the greater costs upon that remaining industry, which is why the world is in such dire straits today and why it's so important for us to understand each of these aspects. So I revised our first categoric fault from originally being inflation and deflation to being circulatory inflation and deflation and maldisposition, because even if you maintained a circulation which was equal to the remaining value of represented property, multiplication of falsified indebtedness would dedicate ever more of that to servicing debt instead, leaving ever less to sustain commerce, which could reflect the value of that industry or sustain consumption of the value of that represented property or production of industry. So that's our first categoric fault. Our third, as I gave it, was inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest. And I had to think for just few weeks. I considered all these other possible problems. And suddenly I realized that every one of them expressed, when you traced it out, expressed that it was a consequence of the only powers of the obfuscation of the currency to corrupt our way of life, and that those two powers were volumetric improprieties and this maldisposition or inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest. So I derived an expression for the second categoric fault, as I usually give them in a list of three, as being systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. Everything else that can happen in the economy falls into that category as a consequence of the powers of this obfuscation to corrupt the volumetric improprieties or to impose this falsified cost of interest and its multiplication of falsified indebtedness upon us. So how do we solve these three things? Very, very, very simple. Mathematically, it requires no more than second grade math skills. Why? Inflation and deflation are defined respectively as increases or decreases in circulation per represented property. Well, how do you solve inflation and deflation then? You solve inflation and deflation one way and one way only, and that is by maintaining a circulation which is always equal in volume to the value of represented property. So, how do you do that? There is one way and one way only in order to do that as well. And that is, first, you have to eradicate interest, because interest will consume ever more of a circulation dedicated to servicing falsified indebtedness instead. So you have to eradicate interest to solve inflation and deflation. And the other thing that you have to do is you have to impose what I call an obligatory schedule of payment. What do I mean by obligatory? You have to pay at this rate in order to solve inflation and deflation. And what is the rate? The rate of payment has to retire principal at the rate at which you're consuming of the related property. So let's just give a quick example of that so we can all get our brains around it. It's very simple to understand. A $100,000 home with a 100-year lifespan. How do we pay for it under mathematically perfected economy? Well, we pay for it at the rate that we consume of it. So we divide the 100-year lifespan into the $100,000 value of the house, and we come up with a linear rate of consumption or depreciation of $1,000 per year. So overall, a $100,000 home would cost us $1,000 a year under mathematically perfected economy, or $83.33 a month. We'll understand that example holds, although I'm not advocating linear rates of consumption or depreciation, but that overall expresses the cost of a home. And of course, how many of your generation in particular, would be unable to own a home if it cost you $83.33 a month? What's more, how many of you would be able to work readily, given that that same house under the present systems across the world, and this holds pretty generally true, its cost, instead of being $1,000 a year, would be approximately $1,000 a month. Well, that means that by transitioning to mathematically perfected economy without any other improvement whatsoever, we're all immediately 12 times as liquid. That means the money that we are earning goes 12 times as far, because our costs are generally decreased on this scale. So that translates to ability to hire people to do much more work, plus a restoration of our right to issue promissory obligations free of exploitation, restores our right or our capacity to restore industry to ourselves. So how do we get there? Let's finish our explanation of our solution, singular solution to three categoric faults. So our effective singular solution to inflation, deflation, and maldisposition is an eradication of interest and an obligatory schedule of payment at retiring principal at the rate of consumption of the related property. In effect, I'm paying you with my production for your production. The banking system is out of the equation then. Now, and so nobody's getting anything for, nothing, and vice versa. So our third categoric fault I gave is inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of falsified indebtedness by interest. And this is solved simply by eradicating interest. There is no other solution to the problem but eradicating interest, particularly as interest is unjustifiable. As I said, we do not borrow money from banks. We all have to get our brains around that. We do not borrow money from banks. The banking system merely publishes evidence of our very own promissory obligations, which are obligations to each other. They do not even involve the banking system. Inherently, and naturally. Banking systems have imposed themselves upon every country of the world with this very purpose in mind, of this purposed obfuscation of the currency, a falsification of indebtedness, and subjection of that falsified indebtedness as if it represented property of the banking system to interest, which results in all of the injustices everywhere around us. And so our solution so far is an eradication of interest and an obligatory schedule of payment retiring principal at the rate of consumption. That solves both our first categoric fault and our third categoric fault. Our second categoric fault, as I gave it, was systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. Well, how do we solve that? That sounds like a big one. But because any manifestation of systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property can only be caused by either our first categoric fault or our third categoric fault or any combination of them, because those are the root causes of any systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property, because we solve volumetric improprieties and because we've solved this terminal impropriety. We have already solved, therefore, systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property in either our first solution or our third solution or any combination of the two. So that's all there is to mathematically perfected economy in the end. And there's a lot of work to get there, of course, mathematically and conceptually, but that's what mathematically perfected economy is. So it's inherently, it itself is an eradication of the banking systems of the world, which is indispensable for us to execute at this time to save us from further plunging into terminal failure. All the things that the governments of the world are doing can only sustain us at the brink of terminal failure for some while longer, whereas, as I explained, we would become immediately 12 times as liquid. So here's what our problems are and why and how we have to solve them immediately. And it comes down to simply this. Our problem is that we've exceeded creditworthiness, and if we don't have mathematically perfected economy in place, what we have to do is we have to seize payment against these falsified debts to the banking system, which are no longer just merely falsified debts. They're falsified debts multiplied over and over and over and over and over and over and over again into further compounded sums of falsified debts, which have made for phenomenal, monumental sums of falsified debt. We have to seize payment against these debts. So basically, the way that I've done this is people just can't walk into courts and do this, or walk into banks and do this because, albeit while the present state of the law is wrong and is unjustifiable and imposes terminal dispossession upon the people, of course, wrongly, nonetheless, in order for a court, for instance, to resolve what would solve our problems, they have to solve all the issues that I have for 43 years. And this responsibility just can't fall to a court willy-nilly, and you can't expect them to do some saintly thing and conjure themselves what is justice here, how do we arrive at justice. So being as I've said, I presented every president since and including Gerald Ford with formal propositions of mathematically perfected economy, the needs to establish it, the means of establishing it, and so forth, which we're going through right now in this discussion. So,